Hello, everybody. Welcome to our last feature of the weekend. Can you believe it? I can't believe it's almost done. So if you haven't met me before, I'm Amanda Farnel. I'm the operations manager for the festival. Just to give you... Just to give you a little idea of why I am moderating this panel, it has been my secret goal since I joined here 10 years ago to get a shipwreck panel. So I finally succeeded. So I am, of course, the one that is going to be hosting it. I promise I will not go long. But just to begin, I know you've probably seen them over the weekend, but I just want to do a quick introduction of our wonderful authors here. So we have Eve Lazarus, a reporter, author, and the host and producer of the Cold Case Canada true crime podcast. She's written 11 nonfiction books, her newest being Beneath Dark Waters, The Legacy of the Empress of Ireland Shipwreck. And we have Ken McGoogan, who has published 17 books, mostly nonfiction narratives, but also novels and memoirs. He has written 5 books on Arctic exploration, including Searching for Franklin, New Answers to the Great Arctic Mystery. So welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
We're all excited.
So to get us started, I just wanted to go into, I think everyone has that story that if you get into something that you're interested enough about to write a book about, you have that moment that sparked the curiosity. So I just wanted to know, what got you into shipwrecks or Arctic exploration? Eve, do you want to go first?
Sure. I just really fell into it. I had been asked to do a party for a lawyer's birthday, and it was just about heritage houses and the stories behind them. And there was a lawyer at the party who worked for a New York law firm, and he went back to New York and told his boss that I'd do this kind of research and look for descendants of long dead people and look for documents and stuff like that. And the lawyer hired me to look into one of the survivors, Gordon Charles Davidson, from Vancouver. And the story was that Davidson had swum the 6 kilometres to shore. And Hugh was fascinated with this because he had a property off the coast of Rimouski where the ship went down. And he swam in the St. Lawrence River most summers. And he thought, if that was true, this was incredible. And he'd interviewed divers and marine biologists, polar ice swimmers, and everyone told him, no, that's not possible. No one could do that at that time of year in the freezing water. And Hugh hired me to see if I could find the survival story. And he said, won't be easy. He died in 1922 and he didn't have any children. And he was right. It really wasn't very easy. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. But it was fascinating to track down, first of all, build a family tree, and then track down, it was Gordon's brother's granddaughter, and she lived in Madrid, Spain, and she was a keeper of the history, and she had Gordon's survival letter, and he didn't swim to shore. And that was just fascinating to me, first because I'd never heard of the Empress of Ireland, and second that a story could be repeated in newspapers and magazines and documentaries, and even at Gordon's own memorial service for 100 years, and just be wrong.
Ken, do you want to give it a shot on how you got into Arctic exploration?
Yeah, well, what happened was I was working as a literary journalist. I was the books editor at the Calgary Herald. And I won a fellowship to spend 3 months at University of Cambridge in England. So I published a few books. And I was looking around for a project, and I hit upon this explorer by the name of John Ray. And I was actually, I'd written 3 novels. I was actually interested in doing something like A.S. Byatt. She did that book called Possession, where there's a historical narrative in the middle, or at the heart of it, and it's framed by a contemporary tale. And I thought, okay, that's what I'm going to do. I went over to Cambridge, and as it turned out, they had John Ray's papers there at the fantastic Cambridge Library, one of those holding libraries. And I started digging into things, and part of the saga was that he was invested in the search for Franklin, And, the mythology is that Franklin discovered the Northwest Passage. And I looked into it, and the more I came to understand the geography of the north, of the Arctic, which is very complicated, I said to myself, wait a minute, this is not right. This guy's been ripped off. History has ripped him off. And I said, no, I can't let that stand. If I write this as a novel, as originally planned, they'll just say, oh, that's just fiction, and we'll move along, nothing to see here. So I set that aside and wrote the story of John Ray and his what he really accomplished in the Arctic, and that got me into the whole thing, and I ended up writing 6 books about the Arctic.
I think, Eve, you mentioned something that I wanted to talk about at this panel, which was that you had never heard of the Empress of Ireland.
Right.
And I think something that we had talked about previously in the lead up to this was why are people obsessed with shipwrecks, first of all, but also what makes a certain shipwreck or maritime historical event last the test of time versus being lost to history. I think we all know about the Franklin expedition. We don't know as much about John Ray. And we all know about the Titanic, but we don't know about the Empress of Ireland, which was a major disaster on the same level as the Titanic. So I wonder if you could go into why you think that people get interested in it and why certain things catch people's imagination versus others. Do you want to take this first, Ken?
Oh, sure. I was sitting back waiting to hear what he was going to say. Actually, I think it's most often a mystery involved. Like the Franklin expedition, they lost 129 men, 2 ships. That was the 1845 expedition. And could never understand, people could not understand why this happened, given that they were so well prepared. And comparatively speaking, I mean, the James Clark Ross and John Ross had spent 4 years in the Arctic and just lost 3 men out of 23. And then there were these horrible tales that came out. And, what happened? So it's a mystery of what happened. The second worst Arctic mystery had to do with Jens Munk, the Danish expedition in 1619. He made his way into Churchill, and he didn't sink, so it wasn't a shipwreck per se, but he sailed in with 64 men, and he sailed out with 3. 3 of them survived out of 64. So it's that kind of, oh my God, what happened here that makes people wonder and pursue the mystery, I think, is part of it.
Eve, do you want to take it on too?
Yeah, it's interesting because you could ask any, as you said, about the Titanic, any 12-year-old kid can tell you about the Titanic. Yet the Empress was a huge Canadian story, and more passengers died on the Empress of Ireland than died on the Titanic. But they were Canadian, and that seems to have just got really lost to history. And when I first started looking into it, when I first heard about the Empress of Ireland, I thought, it's probably an Eastern Canadian story. The ship left Quebec City, it's why I haven't heard of it. But it turns out to be a huge Western Canadian story. Just looking at Saskatchewan, there were 36 passengers from Saskatchewan on the ship. 16 of them were from Moose Jaw, and only 16 in a province came back. You're looking at 139 children under 13. Only 3 survived. 6 of those children who died were from Moose Jaw. And when I started looking at different cities, in Vancouver, next to Toronto, had the most passengers booked. Why don't we know about it? So I started digging into that a bit, just into that question. And a lot of it was when it happened in 1914, it was a huge story. Went right around the world, it was global headlines. But 3 months later, World War I broke out. And there was just more horror than anyone could anticipate. And suddenly 1,056 lives that were lost on the Empress was pretty small potatoes in the whole global scheme of things. So there was that. It's a Canadian story, and it didn't have the glamour of the Titanic, the people on the social register. It went down in 14 minutes, if you can imagine that, probably about the length of time we've been talking now, from the time it was hit to the time it sank. It's amazing to me anyone survived in that horror. And 14 minutes, not really enough time for a motion picture like the Titanic. So there are sort of a number of things why it's disappeared, but why it stayed disappeared. There have been, I think, several, maybe 10 books written about the Empress of Ireland, and some have done quite well. But my book sort of digs into the survivors' stories, and that's my own interest, following their lives, and it follows their lives through the war and onwards. And I'm hoping that will... My dream would be it got into a grade 10 classroom and kids could learn about the Empress of Ireland and not just the Titanic.
And I think all of those are great points, and it brings up an interesting question for me, which is that when you're writing about the Franklin expedition that didn't have any survivors, and you're writing about the Empress of Ireland that had so few survivors, where do you even start with research for that, and how do you, how do you find information about this thing that is so isolated in a point of history? Do you want to start with this,
Sure.
Eve?
I start with newspapers.com, which has just been a game changer when it came out. And when I first started researching Gordon Davidson, the papers weren't online, so it was down to the Vancouver Public Library pretty much every day. And now the work that I did there I can do on, 2 minutes on my phone, which is great. But the more I dug into those initial stories, and that's often, I don't know about you, Ken, but it's often where we start. And, we take that as fact. And clearly, I found pretty quickly after Gordon's story that these stories went really, really wrong, and I couldn't rely just on those initial reports. And it's not hard to see why. Reporters were there within hours, and they were interviewing these survivors that had just lost their kids or their parents or their spouses. And a lot of them were really banged up and truly traumatised. And these reporters, they were using the phone and shorthand, and, there's no Google to fact-check anything. And a massive amount of information went around the world in very short time. And a lot of these stories were just wrong. They'd been sensationalised and they were wrong. So for me, I had to go ahead. I'd had to go in many cases to the archives, Salvation Archives in Toronto, Empress of Ireland in Rimouski, and little archives all across the country. Stettler, Alberta, when I called them about one of the survivors, said, we've got this chest that used to belong to Theo Barsky, and it's in the basement, and we really haven't had a chance to go through it. And I said, let me help you with that. And I was on a plane in Stettler, and we were going through this chest a bit bigger than this one. And that's like a reporter's, winning the lottery. When you get something like that, you always hope that there'll be letters or diary. And there wasn't in this case, but there were photos, and there was a lot of information that sort of let the string keep going.
Ken, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm bouncing off what you just said there, Eve. It's interesting how it's changed, because I've been at this quite a few years. I'm not going to say how many. I was working on a book about Samuel Hearne, British explorer, and I'm a big believer in 18th century explorer, going to where things happened, seeing it, experiencing it. And so I went to the town in England. Well, I went to London, where he lived as an adult. And then I went down to Beaminster in Dorset, because I knew there was some stuff down there, and if there wasn't, there should be. So I was in the archives there, poking around. And the thing about going, England and Europe, in fact, a town like Beaminster, the place is, the town square is identical to what it was in Hearne's time in the later 1700s, so mid 1700s onwards. So that was fantastic, and I was poking around, and I was there was some kind of a mystery with regard to his mother, to whom he'd been sending checks and so forth. And I was trying to track that down. So, but the paper trail wasn't there. And I ended up, well, you know, hardship. I'm a guy for hardship. I went to the pub. And so I was having a Guinness, no less. And I noticed this foolscap tacked onto the wall. And I went over there and started looking at that. It turned out to be a history of this pub in the heart of Beaminster. And it turned out this was the coaching house in Hearn's day. And so I was sitting in the coaching house, and I knew then Hearn had left with his mother to go to Portsmouth and join the Royal Navy. So that was a rush. And then there were a few other things like the streets in London changing on me, but I caught that on an old map. I knew where he was. I went there. But even so, the change came. I got home, and I still had this mystery about his mother. So I'm poking around online one night, and somebody had put up some new material on that period. And I thought, oh, I'll just check. Boom, there it was. I had suddenly a trail back to his mother, and I could see what had happened. So, yeah, it was a real transformation when suddenly so much is theoretically, at least, available online.
Ken, just to follow up on that, one part of your book that I found really interesting was talking about after Franklin went missing, how much John Franklin's wife spent time just reimagining the story and you know, working with Charles Dickens to discredit Ray and and creating this mythos of John Franklin so that he kept on throughout history. How do you, in your research, how do you combat that? Like, you're someone who has put so much effort into taking away the truth at any given moment. How do you know that you've gone far enough to figure out what as close to the truth as you can get?
Well, I had a lot of fun with Jane Lady Franklin. I wrote a whole book about her called Lady Franklin's Revenge. So then I returned to her in this book. But yeah, I got right to the... I got right down into it. She's got the largest archives of handwritten documents at the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, because I went back to go through some of these things. And she would write small, but she had an absolute torrent of stuff. So I was able to, and this stuff is not online, okay? It's only there. And it also gave me a good excuse to go down to Tasmania, because she was with Sir John when he was the Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land. So that was great. So I became writer in residence there for 3 weeks, and I spent that going around and digging out things in the archive that were nowhere else. There's a thing called Montague's Book. Franklin was driven out of Tasmania in disgrace, really. And Montague was the guy who did it. He was the colonial secretary. What an evil SOB he was. Unbelievable, this guy. Anyway, so yeah, I chased Lady Franklin, the way I put it, from Russell Square to Van Diemen's Land, because to me, that's part of the fun. I mean, going where they were, and you see it, and you come to understand it. And she is an extraordinary... She wore the pants in that family. And, okay, after Franklin dies or disappears, so she orchestrates the great search that essentially charted the Arctic, sending out ship after ship. She dunned the British Admiralty into sending out ships, but and she, you know, subscriptions and so forth. But then the way she did it, apart from that, when they began to realize, okay, they found a single document, the Victory Point record, that says, okay, Franklin died in such and so a date. And so, okay, then she was, okay, that was the end of that, but not the end for her, because then she had to turn him into a great myth, because she was wedded to him, and his fate was her fate. So if he was aggrandized, she too was. If he became famous as the discoverer of the Northwest Passage, then that accrued to her. So she went to building statues. You couldn't do it online at that time. We're talking, in the 19th century. So she had statues built, including in Westminster Abbey. It started off, she asked them, can I put a statue in here? And the dean said, well, I don't know. No, she said, discoverer of the Northwest Passage. No, I don't know. She dunned him, and he said, okay, you can put a bust in. She said, great. She had a bust made, and then she built this massive canopy over it that is bigger than any statue in the place. Okay, that's the kind of thing. That's how, and there's a statue down in Australia, just in mainland. There's stuff in Hobart, Tasmania. There's stuff in Spilsby, where Franklin grew up. I mean, she was a master publicity promotion maker, before her time. She was an extraordinary woman.
Yeah, I'm so glad you were talking about that. I think the things that really caught me about both of your books is really the human story behind what was happening and all of the people involved. And Eve, for me, for the people that we were talking backstage before this, and you really wanted to talk about the women who were on this ship, but there weren't a lot of survivors. So how hard did you search for these survivors or these stories to talk about?
Well, to narrow it down, I went after the Canadian survivors, of which there weren't that many. It was about 62. And then I tried to dig into them, find their descendants, find any of their personal letters. It was really important to me to be able to tell their stories in their own words. And that meant sort of going to newspaper articles, to going to the wreck inquiry. There were a number of the survivors that testified there. And then just tracking down letters. In one case I found John Langley was a rancher in Merritt, BC. He was an Irish guy going home to Ireland to settle some family estates. And I found his grandson lived 10 minutes down the road from me in North Vancouver, and we met for coffee. And he had his survival letter that he'd written to his wife, and he had 2 little children. And it was really, really riveting. And they'd even kept the pajamas that he wore or was rescued in. And they're in the museum back in Ottawa now. But that was fantastic because I could really get into that story and tell it in its own words. And when I was playing around on the internet one night, I found one of those really old sort of boards. I can't remember what you call them, but they were the forwarded email was in 20 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. And it was an Empress of Ireland board, and it was just a note from a woman in Ireland said, my grandfather was on it, Martin Gill. I thought, oh, he's one of mine. Martin Gill was from Nelson, and he was a 23-year-old survivor. They kind of connected with Gordon Davidson's letter. He'd written about Martin in his letter. So she had left her email on it, and I sort of crossed my fingers and I fired her off an email and told her what I was doing. And I got a phone call about 2 days later, and Mary was a nun in Ireland, and she'd lived with her grandfather until she was 18. So she had a personal connection to this survivor, and he told her the stories. And she even had the pocket watch that he'd had when he went into the water that had stopped at the exact time that it hit the water. Margaret Greenaway was fascinating. She was a Salvation Army officer, and she and her husband were on their honeymoon, and they were going to the Congress in London. And I found her granddaughter in Oakville, Ontario, and she had the survival letter of her grandmother that she'd written to her parents-in-law. And it was an incredible story. And it was just gold to have these personal sort of letters. And it was such an emotional, all of them were incredibly emotional. I was so happy to have survived and kind of a bit surprised. You know, the tone was always, I don't know how this happened. And they'd be talking about squeezing through these John Langley, in one case, these 10-inch potholes, windows to get on the deck, and just incredible stories.
Yeah, and I think another thing that we were talking about in the lead up to this session that I want to give you both an opportunity to talk about is well, the researching with the papers and running through the trails. Another thing that you both did was travel to the sites and explore in person. And what made you decide to do that? And just give me a little bit about what you did and what made you want to do that and what you felt that you took from that. Do you want to go first, Ken?
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess I started in about 2006 sailing with Adventure Canada, a travel cruise company that sails in the Northwest Passage. The first time I went to the Arctic, I went by myself. It was in 1999, and I was going out to mark the spot where John Ray had built a little cairn to assert his discovery of the final link in the Northwest Passage. So I wanted to go and, because that was exciting to me. Okay, I'm strange. That was exciting to me. So I went up there and met up with a friend, Louis Kamukak, and we went out and did that. But after that, then I began sailing with Adventure Canada, and that immersed me in the Arctic. Okay, people sail into the Northwest Passage, and for most people, you know, you maybe get to do it once. It's kind of a trip of a lifetime. It's very expensive, and you know, it is pretty fantastic. It's another world up there. And but I had the good fortune, since I was giving talks, I would revisit things, and that immersed me. So I began to understand things and get to see things that other people didn't get to see. For example, Beechey Island, probably the most famous site in the Arctic, historical site, the Three Graves. Okay, on that island, you know, okay, I got that, I nailed that, but I hadn't realized that Beechey is connected by an isthmus to Devon Island, which is huge. And Devon Island, the southern coast, all kinds of polar bears. And in fact, I was on Beechey 3 times. I think it was 2008, 10, and 12, when polar bears came charging along that isthmus. Now, like in Franklin's day, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to stand there and shoot that sucker, right? But we don't do that anymore. We have to get out of there. We make for the Zodiacs. But it taught me something about how it worked up there. That's just one example of the kind of thing you can learn only by going to a place. And that's one of the reasons that I really applaud Eve's book, as a matter of fact, because I recognize a fellow spirit, you know, going to a place, okay, and you can communicate what you're feeling and seeing.
I really didn't want to follow you. No wild polar bears, couple of rabid squirrels perhaps on my journey. We went to Rimouski and it was 2019, and at that stage I had no real interest in doing a book. I was just really interested in the research. I hadn't really thought about that. But Hugh, the lawyer who'd hired me to research Gordon Davidson, had arranged a Zodiac to take us out to the wreck site. I am terrified of anything that floats. Terrified. So just to get me on that Zodiac was pretty amazing. And it was a beautiful sunny day in August, and you know, I can't complain about the weather or say that there was fog or thunderstorm. There was nothing. It was just smooth water. And it took us about 45 minutes to get out there, and we had our life jackets on, all that sort of stuff. And when we got out there, I was really surprised that the only thing out there was this little sign, and if you got up really close, you could see it was National Historical Site for expert divers only. And that had only happened in the late 90s, so they'd had decades to pillage everything from the Empress before that. And there was a little buoy. But you could see we had a marine biologist who had hired to take us out there, and he was a diving instructor. And he had the radar where you could look down and see the ship in the trench on a 65-degree angle. And I think at that moment it really hit me that I was floating above an underwater graveyard where about 800 people had been trapped. Back in 1914, they had hard hat divers and, all that really weird, bizarre equipment. And it's not that deep. It's only about 45 metres deep, but the St Lawrence River is really treacherous. It's very cold, it's very dark, visibility changes very quickly, it's tidal. And they'd gone down to bring back bodies, but also the safe and the mail and things like that. But one of the divers had died trying to bring the body back, and they stopped at that point and they said it's too dangerous. Anyone that didn't leave their cabin, which was most of third class because they were under the water where the ship had hit, didn't get out, had to stay there. And I think that was the moment that it really hit me of what this enormous tragedy was. And I think at that moment I decided to write the book.
Yeah, and so you keep leading me to my next points. One thing in your book, Ken, and it was something that we had talked about in the emails before this session, was another thing that really interests me about both of these books is I can really hear both of your voices in it. And something that you mentioned in your book, I believe in the prologue, Ken, was talking about how you wanted to write a book that wasn't the normal creative nonfiction. It subverted the genre because the genre is very conservative. It's very regimented in what you can and cannot do. And Eve, you mentioned that as well in the pre-talks we had. So I want to know what your thoughts are on the current landscape of creative nonfiction, why you specifically set out to put your own voice in the book.
Yeah, I'll be happy to do that because I've been teaching creative nonfiction for 20 years. I did 10 years just in continuing ed at University of Toronto, and then I got into this MFA program teaching there at University of King's College in Halifax. So, as you know, many of you, I'm sure, you teach something, you're going to be immersed in it. So I became very immersed in it and looking at it. So what I feel about history, it's the conventional way history is being written. Okay, we all know history's in trouble, right? It's disappearing from the curricula, high school, university. In my opinion, there's not enough attention being paid to our history. What can I do as a writer? Well, I can't control the curricula, but all I can do is change the way I write. And instead of writing a strictly chronological, straightforward narrative, boom, boom, boom. I mean, look, people get used to going to the movies. Look at how how stories are being told in the movies. Think about Quentin Tarantino and Pulp Fiction, or think about Christopher Nolan and the intertwining of stories. So we get used to that. That's the way we receive narrative. And then you turn to this plotting history, boom, boom, boom. No. So I believe in taking those things. So in addition to the notion of personal presence, which is the hallmark of creative nonfiction, yes, insert personal presence, but also I like to push the limits in terms of craft and the way the story's being told. I think readers are more sophisticated than they're given credit for. Even to the point of doing history via, taking a biographical approach to history. All these things, there's all kinds of room in there within the genre of creative nonfiction to reinvigorate the experience of history.
Well, I've never taken a nonfiction or creative writing class in my life, so I didn't actually know that you weren't supposed to do that. And when I got a review of my book that sort of said, tisk, tisk, this is a history book, what are you doing putting your voice in it? I thought, oh, wasn't I allowed to do that? I didn't know that. It just felt right. When I do a lot of true crime books, and one of them, Murder by Milkshake, for instance, was about a guy that murdered his wife with vanilla-flavoured arsenic milkshakes over time. And research is my thing, and I researched everything. And if you want to murder someone with arsenic, talk to me. I can tell you how to do that. I talk to toxicologists. I talk to police, everything. I'm up on that. Another book was Inspector Vance, who was a forensic scientist who worked from 1914 to 1949. And again, I researched everything about early forensics, and I can tell you anything about fingerprints or bones and everything that they did that. But I spent a lot of time doing the research and then a lot of time hiding that research so it doesn't get in the way of the stories. And for nerds like me, I put appendices in the back, so if you want to read about how long it takes someone, to die from arsenic poisoning and why it's so difficult to detect, that's all there. You can get it. But it's not bogging down the story, because overall I want it to be a good story. This time, I didn't want to do that because I was going all over the country and I was going to these places, I was finding descendants, and I found that really exciting. So I thought, well, I want to bring people along with me, along on the ride. And that's what I tried to do. Has it worked? I'm not sure. Thank you. I'm glad that you enjoyed
Yeah, absolutely it works.
I definitely think that it worked. To go into my next question, I want to point out this trunk, which one of our attendees brought, which is a trunk that traveled on the Empress of Ireland. In one of the last crossings, it traveled the fall of 1913, and it sunk spring 1914, correct?
Yeah, May 1914.
Yeah, so we've got personal history here that has traveled through a family, so people think the story is 100 years away, but there's still people who are connected to the items and the materials. And Eve specifically, I'm thinking of this question for you, because when we were pitched your book, the specific pitch to us was, it is a book about a tragedy, but it's not sensationalized at all. Ah. And is that something that I want to know, is that something that you think about when you're writing it? And where do you find the line between trying to make a book that is educational and people want to read it, but also doesn't just travel the line into sensationalism?
Well, I think that comes back to true crime. I do, as I said, a number of books on true crime in the podcast, but I work very closely with the families. I work with law enforcement that we're closely connected with it. And I get to know them. I get to know them really well, and I get to know through them the victim. I always think before I do anything, I've got the family reading this, do I want them to see this? And I'm also writing about, sort of joking a little bit about this arsenic case, but these are very real people. I worked with the daughter. She was 11 years old when her father murdered her mother in this incredibly horrific fashion. And we've become really good friends, and I've written the book from her point of view. So to me, it was a very sensational story. I didn't need to make it more sensational. To me, the interesting part of it was how she coped with it and what happened afterwards, rather than just the murder itself. And
Ken, do you ever, because the writing about Arctic exploration is I think, a tragedy like the Empress of Ireland, you can really feel the human perspective of it. And I feel like Arctic exploration feels like a lot longer, like farther away. It's not necessarily that much difference of time periods, but do you ever feel like you have to ride the line of sensationalism too in your books?
I don't worry about that, to be honest. No, I just chase the story. Wherever the story takes me, that's where I'm going. And the story is often an excuse to go out and have a good time. Like, it's good fun to be traveling around. Like, I did 6 in the Arctic, but I did 3 in Scotland, and mainly Scotland and Ireland. So, well, hey, I had to go to Culloden. I mean, it just had to be done. Fantastic place. I had to spend some time in Orkney, where John Ray came from. I've got friends there now, so, yeah, doing all that, it's not, I'm not answering your question, but, but I'm having fun. I'm having fun avoiding it.
No, that's okay. And I think it makes sense to me that you don't think about it compared to I think you probably have thought about it a bit more than than Ken, because it's just the time periods aren't that off, but they're very different subjects and they're very different perspectives. And I guess the question I have too that I'm just thinking of is why do you think that we feel more of a human connection towards the Empress of Ireland sinking than I feel like more of a curiosity towards what happened in the Franklin expedition?
Well, I've tried to bring it to life as much as I can. It's farther away. Mm-hmm. That's the whole thing. I think if you've got people you can talk to and they've got trunks,
it's true. It's true.
You got a bit of an advantage there. But yeah, the trick is to bring the story to as vivid life as you possibly can, through whatever means you can, in such a way that it will engage readers. God knows that's what I try to do.
Now we're going to go into Q&A soon, so I just want to get your questions prepped. We want to hear anything that you want. Eve is very excited about Q&A.
I love Q&A.
But I want to give you both an opportunity before we go into Q&A. Ken, because I specifically told you I would give you time to tell us about being shipwrecked yourself. And Eve, I also want to know if there was any other interesting stories that you found that you weren't able to talk about here, or anything you were researching that really surprised you. I'll let you go first.
Okay, well, I guess the biggest surprise was the Western Canadian connection, but a lot of it was, how do I wrap up this story? And I had to laugh. Well, I wasn't laughing, actually. It was horrible. You know, you can get 100 good reviews, but you only remember the one bad one. And I was reading good reads. Never do that. Do you ever read good reads? Don't do that. Anyway, Dr. Evil, that's actually his name on Goodreads, wrote that, oh my God, you know, it was okay for halfway, and then she ran out of material and just lost the plot. And I thought, no, that's when it gets good. That's when I follow the survivors. So, yeah, that was kind of interesting. But for me, I think going back to Rimouski for the 111th last May, so that would be the third time that we'd been there. And the main one was, of course, taking the Zodiac out to the shipwreck. But this time we went back for the 111th, and the Salvation Army came. And it was very apparent that while most of Canada has forgotten, or the world has forgotten about the Empress of Ireland, Rimouski was a tiny little town back then, a French-Canadian town of about less than 3,000 people. And this tragedy just completely overtook them. They were amazing. They took their horses and carts out to the wharf. They brought survivors back. Most of them were naked. They clothed them. They got them medical attention. They took them into their homes. They got them onto the train to Quebec. Streets are named after them. No one's forgotten about it. There are 2 cemeteries there, one for the Catholics, one for everyone else. And the Salvation Army, there were 161 Salvationists on board going back to an international congress. Very few of them survived. It wiped out the entire Canadian staff band, which was a very big deal back then, and the top brass were on the Empress. They all died. Most of them died heroes. They gave away their life belts. They were just truly, truly good people. They've never forgotten. They've done a ceremony every year. One of the little girls that survived, one of the 3 children, she was 8 years old, and she lived until the mid-1980s, and she went to every ceremony in Toronto. And it was so special. We took a bus tour out to the cemetery. The Salvation Army got out there with their uniforms and played the same music that would have been when they took off on the Empress in 1914. And a couple of descendants were there. One of them was the grandniece of a Salvation Army officer who had survived. And the other one was a survivor of an immigrant, Babisky, who he just found out in recent years. And he was a diver, weirdly enough, on the St. Lawrence River. And his ancestor had died. And that was really brought it in, to the human factor of the Empress of Ireland.
That's fantastic. Ken, do you want to tell your stories?
Well, oh, all right. I was actually shipwrecked, in effect, twice. I was on the Clipper Adventurer when it went aground in 2010. But I'll hold that story. It's less dramatic than when I was shipwrecked off Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, in the Indian Ocean. Well, what happened was, ship may be a bit large. It was more a sailboat. And I was teaching in the international school. Is anyone here in their late 20s or early 30s? Okay, you know, or you were all there once, and you were probably crazy. Okay, or you know. Okay, so this one afternoon, Sam, an American fellow teacher, says, I've just bought a sailboat, a used sailboat. What do you think? I mean, yeah, it's a bit windy today, but let's go test it out. And Ed was another American who was there, and we looked at each other. Well, yeah, let's go test out this sailboat. The condition's going to be great. So we went down to the yacht club and got in the sailboat. Sam had done a little bit of sailing, so he knew what he was doing, and we got out there, and it was quite splendid. And, you know, the wind was coming up. Yeah, it was coming up. We noticed that. And we noticed that most of the other sailboats were turning around and going in. And we thought, oh, yeah, well, we're quite far offshore. We're a couple miles offshore. Maybe we should turn around and go in? Okay, yeah, that sounds like a plan, because it's starting to get quite windy. So there's this maneuver called a jibe. And Sam says, okay, duck your heads. I'm going to pull this boom over, and you have to duck under it. And he pulls it over, and the mast snaps because of the wind, and the boat turns right over. It just bounces right over like that and dumps us into the water. And that's when you remember, oh yeah, these are shark-infested waters. So, okay, no problem, Sam says, because if we get on the boat, all three of us, and we can lean back, we can kind of pull it up, and it'll pop up, and you know, we'll be okay. So we all got on the top, and we did manage to turn it over. But the boat didn't pop up because it seems that the airbags had not been inflated, because he just got this boat, right? So it turns out it could support one of us. And Ed says, well, I can't swim. So we're blowing offshore out into the Indian Ocean. And Sam says, well, there's Bongoyo Island out there, and there's a spit of land at the end of it. It's a big cliff, you know, like island, but maybe we can, let's aim for that. So he goes to the front and hangs on the jib, and I'm at the back kind of working with the rudder, and Ed is sitting there in the boat, all high and dry. And I'm thinking about how my white legs must look to a shark. But incredibly, we managed to run aground onto that spit of land, which was not that big. But okay, so we knew we were safe. We tried to get the boat up, but the waves were so huge they were dumping sand into the sailboat, and it just filled up, and it was so heavy we couldn't move it. So we could get the sail down. Now it's raining. Actually, this turns out to be the worst storm of the decade, is what people say. So I say, well, look, you know, there's trees up there. Let's go up into the trees. At least we'll be out of the rain. And Sam says, no, absolutely not. And he wouldn't give any explanation. Later, I learned that there were giant rats living in those trees. So he was quite right not to do that. Because we ended up spending the whole night huddling under that sail while the worst storm of the decade blew over us. And, of course, people on shore noticed the ship was missing and became quite concerned, since the palm trees were bending like this, and it was the worst storm. The whole expatriate community was down at the yacht club wondering where we were. Well, I'm saying, you know, coming up with terrible stories about what had happened before. And come morning, there was a Greek man who had a great big boat. They couldn't come out in a small boat. He had a big boat. He said, well, let's go out and see if we can find them. And he came out. And by this time, we were in the water, because it was warmer in the water than it was in the wind and the rain on the island. So, yeah, we were rescued, and that was my shipwrecked in Tanzania story.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Oh, Charity, we've got one down here. Charity, our intern, has the microphone. She's running by.
Thank you. Eve, I'm interested to learn whether or not in your research you're going to people who are descended and related in some way to for research, letters and so on. Did anyone communicate with you who had not known about their family member in that ship and had learned about it through the work that you did?
Sort of. I've had a few emails since the book's come out, so not at the time everyone I'd connected with had known. But it's been interesting. In the first talk I did was at a small bookstore in Ladner. There was about 15 people there, and I said who's heard of the Empress of Ireland, and all the hands went up. It's like, really? Who's connected? Does anyone have a connection to the Empress of Ireland? And all hands went up. It was, what? And everyone had a relative or some connection to the Empress of Ireland that night. And that was really interesting. They were sort of telling me stories. And a few, since the book's come out, said we had no idea that we had a relative on board. So that's been really interesting. Like, the story just keeps continuing.
Thank you. This has been really, really interesting. I'm just wondering, when you're writing about such in great detail about tragedy, how do you sort of untether yourself or not sort of carry the weight of some of the very great detail that you're writing about? How do you kind of cope with that, or do you find that it might haunt you for a while?
Well, I focus on the craft. How am I going to tell this story? What's the best way to communicate this? And that's basically how I do it when I'm writing about difficult material. Finding the best way to bring it alive for someone else.
Well, it helps when it's a long time ago, like with the Empress of Ireland. Obviously, there's no one still alive. Even children of the survivors have passed on. So that makes it easy for me to stay a bit more removed from it. And I did concentrate on the survivors, and I think that's almost maybe subconscious, because it is much happier. When I hear stories about this whole family of 10 were lost, or 4 little girls from Moose Jaw all died, that's incredibly depressing. So I'm quite happy that I stayed with survivors. But I've been a reporter for decades, and I do tend to compartmentalise things, especially with true crime, and just stay a little bit removed that way.
Okay, maybe 2 more questions. Do we have anything else? Oh.
This is wonderful. Thank you, Amanda. Ken, have you read or heard of The Ministry of Time?
Yeah, terrific book. I liked it a lot.
And it uses probably your research.
Not so much that one. A great many other people have stolen my research. but that book, no, that's fairly removed from anything I've done. So that's why I could sit back and enjoy it. I mean, yeah, I thought it was really well done, a good novel.
And what do we do to incorporate that story into a time travel love story?
Yeah, that was a terrific original approach to it. Yeah, with fiction you can do that.
Oh, behind you. There you go.
Hi, I've been in a position where I've worked a lot in public history, and I've kind of been in a position where I've had to tell people that some of their favorite Canadian historical figures were maybe not that great. People like John A. Macdonald, etc. This is mostly a question for Ken. I'm just wondering how you deal with or approach the people who are very invested in this idea of the hero's journey and Franklin and I guess I'm just wondering how you respond to that.
Yeah, well, there's tremendous controversy around Sir John A. Macdonald and all kinds of other figures about whom I have written, and I try to be aware and sensitive to other points of view. I try to get in as deep and as sympathetically as I possibly can, in order to ascertain or get to the truth. I mean, the truth is an elusive beast, right? In fact, you can almost say there is no final truth. I mean, it's always in your perspective and how you're looking at it, and the truth of something in these kinds of circumstances. Yeah, you can hold up a strawberry and say that's a strawberry, but when you start getting into interpretation of historical events and so forth, whoa, it's not just a strawberry. So it's always weighing and trying to be as accurate and fair as you can.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think that's all we have time for today. But I want to thank you, Ken and Eve, so much for essentially making my dream come true today. This event is just for me.
Thank you.
So we have the Thistledown anniversary presentation happening right outside in the lobby when you leave. So please stick around for that. And if not, just if you're going to stick around and talk, if we could just get you to go towards the art gallery so that event could go on. And have a good night.
Thanks for coming.
All right.